It's a biotech deal-o-rama this Monday, June 2nd, as Sanofi is gaining a drug for a rare immunological disorder via a $9 billion takeout of Blueprint Medicines, and the value for cancer's hottest target, PD-1 VEGF, continues to climb as BMS and BioNTech partner in a $3.5 billion deal, and an Astellas deal with China biotech Evopoint is shining a spotlight on CLDN 18.2 programs at ASCO, which is going on as we record this in Chicago. Plus, the biopharma industry is racing to counter the White House's most favored nation drug pricing strategy. What can they do to counter it? All of that on this week's BioCentury This Week podcast. I'm Jeff Cranmer, Executive Editor here at BioCentury, and joining me are my colleagues.
Simon Fishburne, Editor-in-Chief.
Stephen Hansen, Director of Biopharma Intelligence.
Lauren Martz, Executive Director of Biopharma Intelligence.
And Steve Austin, Washington Editor.
All right, and if you are in the city of Big Shoulders for ASCO, why not stay a couple of days and join Simone and colleagues at BioCentury Grand Rounds, also in Chicago. It kicks off when, Simone? Is it Wednesday night?
It kicks off Wednesday night with a stellar keynote speech by Marty Burke from UIUC, and then a very, very good, I'm told, cocktail networking reception afterwards, and then 2 full days of panels.
Excellent. Yep, Simone, June 4th through 6th. It's at the Four Seasons Hotel in Chicago, and walk-up tickets are still available. This is our R&D conference, so it's quite fun for us. This is number 2. Number 1 was in Nashville last year, and it was a hit. So it's sort of, as our colleague Karen Tkach-Tusman, who's instrumental in putting this on, likes to call it, our Geekchella, but as you may have heard me say on the pod, Lollapalooza being the big music fest in Chicago, I'd say it's more of a Geekapalooza. So Simone and others from BioCentury will be engaging with thought leaders at the academia industry interface, talking critical bottlenecks in translation. You can go to BioCentury Grand Rounds to learn more. And hey, if you're listening to this and you're thinking, I'm a presenting company, can I still present? We have like 2 spots left. You can join the presenting company class at BioCentury. You can reach out to me directly. Simone.
One thing, can I just add one other really important session? You can't, I would say open a newspaper, but these days you can't, look at a news page without seeing what's going on in academia and science, Harvard and other universities. And so we do have a really important panel that's going to be moderated by Lou Borio, currently of Arch Ventures, formerly in FDA, and really a great panel of people who are going to be talking about this particular moment and what does it mean, what for universities and research funding, and what alternative sources might there be that people should start to think about building. This is such an important time. This conference comes at a really important time in U.S. science, and I think that's going to be a really, really good panel.
Sounds good. And we'll have a big group of blue chip investors there, no doubt scouting out some of the presenting companies handpicked by yours truly and Karen Tkach-Tusman. So come check out the new hotness at BioCentury Grand Rounds. And today's episode marks our 300th since we began recording the BioCentury This Week podcast in the spring of 2020. We'd like to thank all of our loyal listeners for helping to make this podcast a success. Okay, let's get to the deals. Stephen, wow, I woke up and it felt like Christmas morning. I mean, there hadn't been deals for a while until the last couple of weeks, and what do we have? We have more than $12 billion worth of biopharma deals today. Where do you want to start?
Yeah, no, I was surprised too. I forgotten what it felt like to have a really busy deal day. Nice to sort of be jumping back into it. So, yeah, no, we can start with the Sanofi Blueprint deal, which, I think Blueprint had long been, so they have Avakit, which is approved, so they have a marketed drug. So it kind of fits, it's not surprising from that perspective, right? Because that's where we've been seeing most of the M&A happening, is around sort of commercial products or commercial companies. So I think they've had a bit of an M&A premium on them for a while. What's interesting here, I think, is it's one of these few, again, I think before we've also talked about how growth has been really important. What companies have been looking for growth, and that's where I think this one kind of jumped out. So Advocates, it's sort of fairly early in its launch to treat mastocytosis. They're projecting, they're guiding for about 700 million in sales this year, but by 2030, they're aiming to hit 2 billion. So this is a multi-billion-dollar potential product in this mast cell disorder indication, and it seems to fit really well with Sanofi's focus on immunology. I mean, that's really where Sanofi is spending a lot of their time and energy now, is different immunology settings, and so this kind of slots in quite nicely there.
Stephen, so with the acquisition of Blueprint, they gain a marketed product and one behind that, that in phase 2-3, I believe, something like
That's
that, right, against the same target and for the same orphan indication. Talk a little bit about that indication. It seems to me that they're basically going to have a big head start over anybody else. I don't know how big the indication is. What's the importance of this, either indication or this target, that in this acquisition?
Well, I think what's really good about this program in this setting in mastocytosis is that the vast majority of patients are all, the driver for their disease is the same mutation, and so you can go after a large portion of these patients with one of these single assets. And so, as you rightly say, they've got one out there now. They have another one that's sort of a fast follower that they think they're sort of pitching as potentially having a better safety profile. And so, I think this really gives Sanofi the opportunity, as you say, to maybe really build a very strong sort of franchise in the setting that, 2 billion is nothing to shake your fist at. So, I think there's a good opportunity here for Sanofi to try and nail down this opportunity. And I think that's why they were willing to pay over 9 billion for it.
Stephen, one more thing is that we're coming up on nearly 2 years, I believe, since Hooman Ashrafian took over as head of R&D at Sanofi. He'd previously been a VC, so that was kind of a new thing to have a VC head up R&D. But, he really seems to be doing some interesting deals. This is a takeout, maybe his second takeout since he's joined, and there's been, I think, a few partnering deals. So it seems like that, together with Paul Hudson's strategy, very, very clear immunology or I&I direction for Sanofi, right? Any
Yep.
thoughts on that?
No, that's right. I mean, I think, that's obviously, that's where their biggest product is, right? I mean, Dupixent is where in that I&I field, that's where they've had the most success. And so I think it makes sense that their BD strategy has followed that.
And Hooman, of course, from SV Health Investors, he founded and chaired several of SV's biotechs back in the day: Alchemab, Citrix, Mestag, T-Rex Bio, one of my favorably named biotechs. Lauren, I'm curious. I recall Blueprint kind of struggling a little bit with one of their therapies. Was it the RET inhibitor that they struggled to sell?
Yeah, commercially, the RET inhibitors had faced some challenges. Gavreto, which is the inhibitor that was developed by Blueprint and licensed to Roche, was ultimately given back to Blueprint because of some commercial challenges. And, Eli Lilly's competitor in the RET inhibitor space also has faced challenges, though not to the same extent.
All right. Well, good to see Blueprint getting a win. We love it when biotechs fight the good fight for a long time and then get a nice takeout at the end of the day. And Stephen, we've been following the PD-1, PDL1, VEGF space for some time now. It really got going with Akeso's therapy, partnered with Summit a few years back. Tell us about this partnership between Bristol Myers and BioNTech.
Yeah, so I guess I would start with it's good work if you can get it right. So So BioNTech did a deal in November 2023 with Biotheus in China to get ex-China rights for their PD-L1 VEGF bispecific. They paid $55 million up front in that deal. A year later, they spent $800 million to buy out the rest of, to buy Biotheist and basically acquire full rights to this program, plus some other pipeline products, bispecific platform, that sort of thing. But mainly to buy out, have full control over this bispecific program. And then turn around 6 months later, and they're getting $1.5 billion upfront from Bristol, plus another $2 billion that's essentially fully guaranteed that they'll get in anniversary payments through 2028. And that's only for half of the value of the program. So they're still getting to retain 50-50 rights globally. So they'll split 50-50 on development costs, manufacturing costs, and then profits and losses. And so, yeah, pretty good terms, I would think, for flipping it around in about a year.
So a lot of China names coming up. Biotheus. We're going to talk about EvoPoint in a moment, and Akeso, of course. China.
And it does. And we're only 2 weeks after Pfizer spent $1.25 billion on a PD-1 VEGF bispecific from 3SBio. So the price tag seems to be rising and rising every single day.
Yeah, you really got to get in on the China biotech scene if you want to keep pace. And we'll be talking about that in October in Shanghai at the China Healthcare Summit. We'll tell you a bit more on that in a special podcast that we have coming up. And speaking of Akeso and Summit, there was a bit of data out late last week that investors at least appear to be disappointed in. Summit lost quite a bit in valuation. How much did they lose?
31%.
31%. Yeah. And were these data? It met the PFS endpoint, right, Lauren? But it missed on overall survival. Can you break that down for us?
Right. So the market did not respond well to the data last week. This was a readout, the first phase 3 global study readout for ivonescimab, which is the Akeso and Summit PD-1 by VEGF antibody. I think, as you mentioned, it met the PFS endpoint with a PFS hazard ratio of 0.52, which is pretty good, I would say. And to backtrack, this is in a population of non-small cell lung cancer patients who have EGFR mutations as second-line therapy. So this is after patients had a third-generation EGFR inhibitor. So this is a different population than what was tested in a phase 3 study in China by Akeso last summer that, has sort of just been the catalyst for all of this excitement around the PD-1 and VEGF bispecific space. So I think part of the reason for the negative market response was just that there was so much excitement after that readout last summer. Part of the reason was that in that indication, a separate non-small cell lung cancer indication, first line in combination with chemotherapy in patients who don't have the EGFR mutations, it beat Keytruda, because Keytruda is the standard of care there. So anything that beats Keytruda is, a huge deal. Here, Keytruda is not used as the standard of care. It didn't go against Keytruda. You don't have that big excitement around that endpoint. The other reason, it missed overall survival. That's a problem because they're saying they can't file with FDA without an overall survival benefit. So more data is needed, I guess. And then on the PFS endpoint, this is a very positive progression-free survival result. We don't have the actual PFS numbers, but this trial includes patients from a Chinese phase 3 study run in China, the Harmony A study, that was positive in the same, very similar population. It wasn't just third generation EGFR inhibitors that were used in the first line. It was any EGFR inhibitor, but it was a very similar population. They used data from many of those patients in this trial. So the problem is in that study in China that actually led to the ivonescimab approval in China, the PFS hazard ratio was a little bit higher. And we know that more than half the patients in this new study were patients from China. So that is suggesting, I think, to investors that it's possible that the patients in the US and in Europe who were included in the study maybe didn't perform as well on progression-free survival as those patients that we've already had the data from in China. So I think that was a bit of a concern as well.
So, Lauren, a couple of things there. You absolutely totally agree with you that the real excitement when the first data came out was about the idea that it could be better than Keytruda, because nothing's really done that before. So my first question is, do we have any update on whether that data in terms of being better than Keytruda will bear out in a bigger population? Because understanding this data or this trial doesn't really test that. And the other question, I suppose, is, there's really been a flood of companies that have gone after this target pairing, right? VEGF and PD-1 or PD-L1. And how pivotal are these data or the next data for that sort of target pairing? Is everybody kind of on the fence waiting to see? We do know this industry phenomenon of, I don't know what they call it, target crowding. I call it the lemming effect. I guess it depends on whether they fall off the edge of a cliff or not. Maybe you can just talk a little bit about the context of that bigger VEGF PD-1 picture.
Sure. So I think a lot of people were looking to these data that just came out as for evidence that the results that have been seen in patients in China can be reproducible at the global scale. There may be hints that there could be some potential issue based on the potential PFS deficit, but I think the real indicator will be when the global phase 3 trial that Summit is running in the first-line non-small cell lung cancer setting reads out. And right now that's, about 2 years behind this study. So it'll still be a while. I think as far as this target combination pairing, we've seen multiple other programs have positive data in different indications. We've just heard a little bit about the program from BioNTech. There have been others. I think some indications will be a better fit for this combination, this bispecific design than others. I think that the first line non-small cell lung cancer setting without EGFR mutations is probably a place where there's a lot of opportunity to improve on the standard of care. This is a setting where PD-1 inhibitors work, where VEGF inhibitors are relatively toxic because the effect isn't localized. If you can, take advantage of PD-1 in the tumor microenvironment and bring VEGF there, you have a chance to really improve on the responses. In an indication like EGFR mutant non-small cell lung cancer, this is more traditionally considered a cold tumor. So I think, there is an opportunity for this mechanism to help overcome some of the resistance in cold tumors. The problem is, how much benefit are you getting from that localization part of this mechanism if there's not as much PD-1 around the tumor? So I think we'll get more information about how much that matters as more of these trials read out. In the meantime, I think companies are just kind of trying to partner with pharmas and get the broadest programs that they have to test this in as many indications as possible.
I mean, that's what I was thinking of today. I mean, Summit's got to find a partner or look for a deal soon, right? I mean,
the fact that BioNTech needed to means,
well, that's what I'm
if
saying.
You look at these programs exploding,
BioNTech
how broad can they go?
BioNTech had 16 billion euros in cash, and they still thought they needed to bring a partner on to try and run a really broad program. I don't know how Summit, I mean, it seems like, you got Pfizer, Merck, and now Bristol. They're all going to be running like Keytruda-like.
So, Stephen, the question
program.
is who's left. The question is who's left, because you got to assume that we're not the only ones to have thought of that. That Summit's probably being courted, right?
Well, that's why. That's why Summit was worth $20 billion at one point, right? Because everyone put a huge M&A premium on the name, and now I don't know if I was a Summit investor, I'd be worried that you're getting left behind a little bit here. I mean, I know they're ahead,
or you'd be rubbing your hands with the payout that you're going to get when they do actually do a deal.
Well, that's the thing. I would worry that they need to do a deal sooner rather than later, or else you're potentially going to get surpassed if you've got these other farmers that are going to be running these massive development programs.
And all these new biotechs that are popping up with new design tweaks for these.
Yeah.
Is this necessarily the best way to do it?
There's only so many companies that have the cash and the clinical infrastructure capable of running those broad of a program. So the number's dwindling, I would say.
Well, maybe we soon on this podcast will be referring back to this conversation if they actually...
There we go.
Well, that valuation hit they took on those data, Lauren, 6 billion. So, Stephen, down to 13 billion now. All right, let's look at another deal involving a China biotech coming red hot out of Suzhou. EvoPoint has done a deal with Astellas, partnering up on EvoPoint's antibody drug conjugate against CLDN 18.2. And the newest member of the BioCentury team, Tierney Baum, took a look at these programs happening at ASCO. Can you tell us a little bit about this deal and where the program fits in against other programs that we're seeing come on the stage in Chicago this week, Lauren?
Sure. So data from this program was covered in one of the 11 abstracts that Tierney wrote about last week. So this was on our radar before this deal was announced. 5 of those are antibody drug conjugates against the target. And notably, all 11 are from companies located in China. This was $130 million deal that Astellas made upfront, I think, as an effort to secure Astellas' leadership within the Claudin 18.2 space. They were the first company to get an approval last year with the first-in-class antibody against the target. Astellas also has a bispecific against Claudin 18.2, and this gives the company an antibody drug conjugate too. So obviously the indications will overlap for all 3 modalities, and I think the jury's still out on which one will end up being the best modality for the indications that express a high level of this target. It's hard to compare these programs, based on the early clinical data that we saw at ASCO, but this does look to be one of the more active programs that Tierney covered in that story. And she did also speak with Astellas' chief strategy officer, Adam Pearson, last week, who mentioned that one of the attractive things about this program in particular is that the payload and the linker have been validated by more advanced ADC programs. So, this is a new target for ADCs, but the fact that this MediLink sourced linker and payload have been used in other ADCs was an attractive factor for the company.
I'll drop a link in the show notes to Tierney's piece, and you can see the nice little table of all the programs in there. And if you like what you're hearing, drop us a review, leave us a question. We'd love to hear from you. We're going to take a quick break, and we're going to turn to Steve in Washington.
BioCentury This Week is brought to you by BioCentury Grand Rounds. Grand Rounds. BioCentury's R&D conference will return in 2025 to the US and Europe to debate key bottlenecks in translation and unlock scientific breakthroughs with commercial potential. Connect with VCs, academic innovators, and biopharma R&D and BD leaders to explore cutting-edge advancements in early-stage R&D as we dive into disease biology, therapeutic modalities, and enabling technologies. Join us in Chicago this June after ASCO for the second BioCentury Grand Rounds US, and in Cambridge, UK this September for the inaugural Grand Rounds Europe. Register and learn more at biocenturygrandrounds.com.
Okay, we are back on the BioCentury This Week podcast. Steve, the White House is demanding 85% across the board drug price cuts. That's what you reported last week when you took a look at what the president refers to as his most favored nation strategy. What are you learning, Steve?
So look, President Trump put out an executive order on the so-called MFN, most favored nation, drug pricing on May 12, and a lot of people dismissed it. It doesn't create new authorities. There's no enforcement mechanism in there. But I spoke last week with pharma and bio CEOs, consultants, the trade associations, lobbyists, attorneys, including several individuals who talked about MFN with Trump personally and with his cabinet and with White House staff. And they say he is very, very serious about it, and the administration is very serious about it. And people are actually surprised, the ones who I spoke with, that there hasn't been a broader understanding of how serious this is. As you said, the White House has met with senior executives from 8 pharmaceutical companies over the last 2 weeks, and they're going to be meeting with more. They're demanding voluntary 80 to 85% cuts across the company's entire product portfolios in the drug pricing. That level of discounting would essentially put the companies out of the business of making innovative drugs. So, people are looking at that, the people who are involved in it, as an opening gambit in a negotiation, but it's not quite clear where the whole thing goes. It is clear where it came from. So here's the background on that. In the first week of May, pharma and bio believed that they were very close to securing their top legislative priority, fixing the IRA's so-called pill penalty by extending the Medicare drug price negotiation exemption for small molecule drugs to 13 years. That would be the same as what it is for biologics. House Republicans had agreed to include the fix in the sweeping tax and immigration package. President Trump had endorsed it. So yippee, right? But the industry's jubilation turned to horror as they learned that in addition to promoting the pill penalty fix, Trump had demanded that Republicans include provisions in the reconciliation bill that would create most favored nation drug pricing for Medicaid drug purchases. Pharma commissioned a study of this, and that study estimated that over a decade, this would cost $1 trillion. It would suck $1 trillion out of the pharmaceutical industry in a decade. So pharma CEOs flooded Capitol Hill. They persuaded Speaker Johnson to inform Trump that his big, beautiful bill couldn't pass the House if Medicaid most favored nation was included. So industry thought, great, they've got a win here, right? Well, Trump did agree to pull out Medicaid most favored nation from the bill, but he also demanded that the IRA pill penalty fix get pulled out of it. And then, over the next weekend, Trump instructed his staff to draft the MFN executive order. All this makes it clear that Trump is personally invested in this. He apparently believes that doing something extremely dramatic on drug pricing is critical to shoring up Republicans' chances in the 2026 midterm elections. So you may ask, how's it going to happen? What could Trump do? What could the Trump administration do to enforce most favored nation drug pricing? And I'd say a couple things. So first, I'd say that you can expect asymmetric attacks, right? The Trump administration's already demonstrated in a lot of other venues that they're very skilled at using kind of bureaucratic brawlers to do things that people wouldn't expect it. I don't think anybody expected, for example, that the White House would tell Harvard that they could no longer enroll foreign students and that all the foreign students had to get out of Harvard within a week. The courts have stopped or at least slowed that down, but that's an example of the kind of asymmetric attacks that you might see. And there's an interesting hint about that in the executive order on most favored nation drug pricing. There's a provision in there where it discusses FDA's authority to take regulatory action against drugs that are unsafe or that are improperly marketed. Well, there's nothing new about that. So why is it in there? Pharma CEOs who I spoke with view it as really a veiled threat that they could use FDA to go after companies that fail to provide the kind of price concessions voluntarily that the Trump administration wants. People who I spoke with said it's basically like saying, you got a nice drug there, sure, it would be a shame if something happened to it. That's one thing. And then there's a provision in the executive order saying that if the companies don't voluntarily agree to slash their prices to being lower than those in peer countries, the United States, that HHS Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr. should promulgate a rule, a most favored nation drug pricing rule. So you may ask, well, what does that mean? What that most likely means is that they would use CMS's Center for Medicare and Medicaid Innovation to create a mandatory nationwide pilot project. That's what the Trump administration attempted to do that. And it's in the first Trump administration focused on Part B drugs.
Steve, that is a lot to digest. Okay, we all know that the Trump administration in version 1.0 went down the most favored nation MFN route. And I remember that sort of got held up for technical reasons and then dropped. But why is it going to be different this time? What should we be thinking about in terms of that environment versus this one? And why should we worry more this time? Or should we worry? Or should we? Maybe I shouldn't phrase it that way. Should we worry more this time, or will it all just sort of settle down and be fine?
No, it will not. It will not settle down and be fine. We should be worried about it. People should be worried about it. At least they should be taking it very seriously. I think this is in the category of things where it's a very, very real threat. There are things that the industry can do and will do to try to mitigate the threat, and we can talk about that in a few moments. And if they do, then then perhaps the threat goes away. Perhaps the threat is not realized in the fashion that people are expecting it to. That doesn't mean that it wasn't a real threat in the first place, right? So in the first Trump administration, the most favored nation drug pricing demonstration project wasn't launched. They didn't attempt to launch it until after the election, until after the November election. They did it in a tremendous rush, and they basically ignored legal requirements for notice and comment. And it was taken to court. The industry got preliminary injunctions and temporary restraining order attacking it, preventing it from being implemented. But those were all on procedural grounds, not on the substance of it. This time, of course, the Trump administration isn't doing this in its final days. It's doing it in its early days, right? So there's plenty of time for the administration to put together a legally defensible most favored nation CMMI demonstration project. The most likely way that it would do it, I think, is for Part B drugs, but it's possible that they could have something even broader, and they maybe even be looking at Part D drugs as well. So taking a step back, it was defeated on procedural grounds. But what's interesting is that the pharmaceutical industry, bio and pharma, commissioned a number of studies from consultants and economists looking at what the impacts on innovation and what the impacts on the business models and on patients and on physicians would be of a most favored nation pricing model. So an analysis that was done by the consulting firm Vital Transformation that was submitted to a federal court estimated that the Part B MFN model that was being proposed would have reduced industry revenues by $70 billion a year, that it would have triggered radical U.S. industry consolidation, and it would have cut the number of new drug approvals expected over a decade to 7. Another analysis that was submitted as part of the litigation against that rule, authored by Amitabh Chandra, a professor at the Harvard Kennedy School, argued that MFN policy was fundamentally at odds with the U.S. approach for determining healthcare prices, that it ignored constraints on raising prices in OECD countries, and that it would harm the very Medicare beneficiaries it aimed to help. He argued that an MFN policy targets the most valuable drugs, and those are the drugs that help the most number of patients and can command higher prices because of their therapeutic value. And he said basically that the impact on innovation would be immense, and that companies would find it impossible in that kind of an environment to receive a return on investment for developing innovative drugs.
Steve, it's obviously a very complex landscape. I'm trying to understand how much bipartisan interest or support there is for this. There's the old industry strategy of kick the can down the road, just sort of keep putting it off so that the next administration will come in and it'll die, right? That's what they've tried forever. I don't know that would work this time, certainly not around drug pricing writ large. But how do you think, I hear what you're saying, that there's a lot of industry experts from Harvard, Amitabh Chandra and other people explaining the reasons why this might not work. But to what degree is that targeted at Trump and this particular MFN rather than efforts that Democrats as well are interested in reducing drug pricing?
There's universal agreement among healthcare economists, among biopharma CEOs, that a most favored nation drug pricing policy is irrational, that it wouldn't work, and that it would cause immense damage. There's also, I think, general agreement that those arguments are not going to sway the White House, right? And they're not going to sway Democrats in Congress. It probably doesn't matter whether there's bipartisan agreement on this, because the most likely path forward is a demonstration project that the Trump administration could do without needing any more authority from Congress. But it happens that there is a great deal of bipartisan support for it. Bernie Sanders has co-authored legislation, most favored nation pricing legislation, with Josh Hawley. Talk about strange political bedfellows. So there is a broad bipartisan support for the idea. I think that the most likely thing that's going to happen, the most optimistic thing that I've heard from people who are involved in this, is the idea of coming up with some kind of a deal, that the industry could come up with some kind of a deal with the White House, probably with Trump personally, to make some kinds of concessions that would give Trump and give Republicans a sense of a win here. They're talking to the Trump administration through multiple channels. David Ricks, the chairman and CEO of Eli Lilly, speaks regularly with the president. Other CEOs and trade association leaders are talking with the White House Domestic Policy Council, with CMS Administrator Maymon Oz, with consultants who are close to the Trump's inner circle. So some of the elements of a deal that the industry is talking about and hoping to get would involve, for one thing, targeting the gross to net pricing gap that's driven by PBM rebates. There's a sense that eliminating PBM rebates could reduce list prices by 20 to 30%, and that wouldn't affect the net revenues for drug manufacturers at all. Another idea that's gaining traction in the industry is to trade some kind of paring back or reductions in the 340B discount program, which has grown to over $60 billion a year now, and to use those kind of concessions from 340B in exchange for lowering net drug prices across the board. Reviving the IRA pill penalty fix could also provide increased revenues for industry that they could use to offset some of the costs of lowering net and list prices. So those are some of the kinds of things that they're hoping for. They're hoping to put together some kind of a deal. And there's a sense in the industry that there isn't a lot of time, that they have to do something fairly quickly. As you mentioned, the idea of kicking the can down the road. There's no way that they're going to be able to kick the can down the road for over 3 years till the end of the Trump administration. There's also no way that they can have confidence that the courts would simply reject a most favored nation CMMI demonstration project. The industry should have learned the lesson from the IRA, from the Medicare drug price negotiation program, that they can't simply rely on the courts to knock out something that is reducing the industry's revenues. So something's going to have to give. I think something's going to have to give in the next 3, 4, 5 months in that kind of a time frame. And as I said, if the industry doesn't find a way to make some kind of a deal that's acceptable to Trump and to the White House and the congressional Republicans, then I think it's likely that we're going to see some kind of MFN rule for Medicare, Part B, Part D, maybe both, that would have very, very dramatic impacts on the business models and revenues of the American pharmaceutical industry.
Agree with you, Steve. Say what you will about the Trump administration. They are moving fast. And so we will be following developments on these negotiations, on what may play out very closely in BioCentury. Steve has his ear to the ground. And if you want to get a little bit of a deeper dive, he went pretty deep there, but you can check out his story that we ran on Friday. I'll drop a link in the show notes. Thank you for tuning in this week. If you're off at ASCO, best of luck with your meetings and presentations. And don't forget to drop by BioCentury Grand Rounds at the Four Seasons on the 4th, 5th, and 6th. That's it from us. Steve, Stephen, Lauren, Simone, thanks for joining us. Cole, thanks for making things run smooth. Cole, of course, is our production guru. And as always, a special thank you to Kendall Square Orchestra, which makes the music for all of BioCentury's podcasts.